Hi, this is Dr. Nazare, getting ready to do a new video for you. Today I'm going to talk about what is trauma. You know, what is the definition? How do we understand what's trauma versus just an injury, versus just hurt feelings, versus something that's upsetting? Because trauma has to be bigger than just getting injured or getting upset with something or getting disturbed by something. It has to be more than that. So I'm going to tell you what trauma is, the definition of it, so that I can better understand it. And then I am going to tell you of an incident that happened today with a couple that I was working this morning, to give you kind of an idea of what happens when we get triggered. So let's get to it. So I want to connect for you that trauma and trigger are connected. So I want to connect that it's connected. And one way to see this is that when we get triggered, which starts with a T, it's indicative of trauma. So we don't get triggered without trauma. So we all kind of know pretty much when we get triggered. And we all know that we are people who can get triggered. And the areas where you get triggered basically is like the noise that a mechanic would hear in a car that indicates there's problems somewhere. So the problem when you get triggered is that there's trauma at the end of that lane, if you wish. So and by the way, when we get triggered, we may not admit to other people that we're triggered. We may not be comfortable telling people that in fact we are triggered. But we know when we're triggered, and we know that it is excessive dysregulation in your being and excessive emotion. But many people are not willing to actually recognize to the other, I'm triggered. It is much better when we're able to do that, because then the other person understands a little bit more what might be happening and you could get more help. But let me start by telling you what is trauma. So trauma occurs when we are experiencing an unbearable state of aloneness in the presence of overwhelming affect, overwhelming emotion. So this typically happens in our development when we're children, but of course it can happen in war conditions. It can happen in natural disaster conditions like earthquakes or fires, and of course war. The original notion of trauma came from war veterans. And they used to call it, well, the first name was shell shock. And it was shell shock because it came from war conditions. And that's when they first noticed these symptoms, and they call it shell shock. And later it's been called trauma, and in particular developmental trauma, when the trauma occurred during childhood. Why does a lot of trauma happen in childhood? Because we're very vulnerable during childhood. We have a lot of need of our parents or our caretakers. And I also want to tell you that there is no childhood that escapes being injured. So every single child gets injured. How often, how severe, how intense, it differs from person to person, from family to family, depending on what's going on, what's happening. But there is no human being. So when you talk to a friend or a new friend, or you're creating a new relationship with someone, just know that that person, they may be aware and tell you or not, but know that they also will have some injury, because we know when we're injured and we know that we have triggers. But sometimes many of us don't recognize that other people also have injuries and that other people also have trauma. So again, the definition is the experience of overwhelming, unbearable aloneness. Unbearable aloneness meaning it's really unmanageable, the level of solitude and aloneness that we have. Not solitude, because solitude is a good feeling, of loneliness and aloneness, okay? And that it happens when we're experiencing an emotion that is overwhelming. And what happens in childhood is that events happen that cause us to feel overwhelmed emotionally, and that we don't have anyone to go to. So we may have people around us that we could go to, and by the way, that is what attachment is. Attachment is, and it happens in all mammals get attached to their caretakers, and it's a biological need, just the same as needing to eat and needing to eat. The attachment is a biological need. Sometimes people, they've heard a lot of things about attachment and they think that some people don't attach. Well, I want to clarify that every one of us attaches, and all animals, mammals, attach. And what it means is that in times of stress, physical distress or emotional distress, or stress of any serious kind, we mammals go toward our caretakers when we're very young. So that's all mammals. That happens to dogs, that happens to cows, that happens to horses, all mammals. We are different in that we are identical to all mammals. After all, we are mammals. So we do move toward, when we're young, to an adult, to a caretaker. But we're different in that that continues to happen into adulthood. So in adulthood, we still need, for soothing, we still need to go to a figure that we trust. And we attach to that figure. So we attach as children to our caretakers. And I say caretakers knowing that sometimes it's not our mother or father who take care of us. So it's those who take care of us. It could be an aunt, it could be a grandparent, it could be indeed your mother or your father. But know that all mammals attach, and so did you, and that we continue to go toward somebody when we experience emotional, physical, or psychological distress. So what I mean by the aloneness of the definition of trauma is that when you do try to go to people when you're traumatized, when you're having this overwhelming emotion, but some of these people are not able to attend to you. And they may do it by rejecting you, downright rejecting you, being dismissive, putting it down, making it no big deal. Or they may do it because they themselves feel overwhelmed by your distress. And that's another type of caretaker that has a lot of emotion, but they're flooded by the emotion, the caretaker. As a result, you don't get care because you now see a caretaker, a parent, a father, a mother that is getting overwhelmed by your own anxiety or your own fear. So therefore, they're not able to help you. So two ways in which we get a lack of response and care and empathy and attunement to that pain is one is the type of people that are dismissive that I've talked to you about other times, and they will minimize it. They will say it's not a big deal. They will say this is normal. They will make comments that tell you that it really doesn't need to be tended to, and they won't tend to you. And the other is the exact opposite, and is the kind of person that gets very connected to your emotion, but they're flooded, and as a result, they cannot attend to you. So as children, we learn that these two types of caretakers will not attend to our emotional distress. And so we create defenses, we create protectors. So now I'm going to tell you about what happened today as an example of trigger and trauma. So I was seeing this couple today, and unfortunately, very early in the session, the wife got triggered. And the husband was saying that he's noticed that she has a tendency to feel left out and to feel like she's less important, and that other people are more important, and that happens very often. Her feeling of being left out, an outsider, and somebody else taking the priority. Even though that may not be what happens, he was telling in the session that happens to her very often, and it happened. And so what happened is that she had felt that during a gathering this Christmas season with other friends, he had been paying more attention to his sister. And he had been making a lot of effort to make his sister comfortable with his friends, because it was a gathering with friends. So this happened, she got triggered. We can now know that if she's triggered, it has to do with trauma. And this narrowing of focus that I've talked to you about in terms of psychic equivalence happened to her. And in this session, she started by saying that nobody was listening to her. And so then I inquired into how she thought I wasn't listening to her. And she said, no, you're not listening to me either. So when she said that, I had to remind her of the times I had been paying attention to her directly. Unfortunately, because I have good memory, I could remember several events where I had turned to her, asked her questions, asked her what would help, asked him to do something different so it would be helpful to her. And because she was in psychic equivalence, even though I reminded her of how I had listened to her, it didn't seem to make a lot of difference. So remember, in psychic equivalence, you believe your thoughts over facts. So I was presenting to her facts of very recent events, because the session was only an hour. So it had only happened like maybe 15 minutes earlier, maybe at the most 20 minutes earlier. But even though I tried to remind her of how I had done it, and when I told her I had done it, I could tell she could remember that, it wasn't enough to change her mind about not being listened to. And a few minutes later, she then said that she was being attacked. And again, I had to ask her how she was being attacked. And I wanted her to give me an example. And she couldn't really give me an example. So then I said, well, I need to know, because I don't think I've attacked you, but I need to know how you thought you were attacked. And she had a baby with her, and the baby was touching some things on a shelf, And I told her to please ask me first before she gave things to the baby, because I have delicate things in my office. So I didn't want her to just grab things and give it to the baby. I wanted her to ask me first just in case. And then later on, the baby was, she's a toddler now, and so she's touching everything. So she took her to the window, and she was putting all her little hands on the window, which was going to make it all full of handprints, which is fine. I would clean it later. But when she went to the other side of the door, that also is a window, I told her, just keep her to the one window, if you don't mind, because that way I can just clean that one later. And she actually presented my asking her to please keep the baby to the one window versus all of them, and my asking her to please ask me before she grabbed something for the baby. She actually considered that an attack. So this is a perfect example of how our minds distort, because I don't think anybody would think that my asking her to please ask me if she grabbed something for the baby in my office, that would be an attack, or asking her to limit the little baby's hands on the windows to one side. But that is what happens in psychic equivalence. So this is somebody who, as I've told you before, in psychic equivalence, you could be in it for a short period of time or prolonged time. And some people go into it frequently, and some people, when they go to it, they stay long. Someone else, with me telling her and reminding her of how I had listened to her, may be able to readjust and recognize that indeed it had happened and not feel like she's not listened to anymore. Again, someone else that's not in the depth of psychic equivalence, if I say, how did I attack you? She may come to realize that I didn't really attack her. That wasn't the case here. So this is an example of what happens with trauma, and an example of how trigger is connected to trauma, and that when you're triggered, your view gets narrow. You don't see the whole picture, and what's happening is that when you're triggered, you are predicting the future from a defensive posture. In other words, at some point in her life, she was an outsider. She was left out of things. And at some point in her mind, she was attacked. I don't mean physically, but sometimes it could be physical, but put down or rejected or ridiculed, right? And that happened. And what happens when we get triggered is that we have now an expectation that the past is going to be repeated. That is what's actually happening when we're triggered. And the past is the traumatic event, right? So again, to wrap it up for today, for you to understand what trauma is, and again, to reiterate, it's that you feel very alone. So if we have any traumatic experience in childhood or in adulthood, but we have somebody to go to, and that person listens with empathy and care, that event will not be traumatizing, believe it or not. So we could go through really difficult experiences, but if we have someone to go to, and the person listens to us, offers empathy to us, and offers support to us, what could be a traumatic event doesn't become traumatic. This is very important, particularly for you parents. Because as long as you go back to the child and repair, that's not a trauma. And for people in horrible conditions, such as war or hurricanes or other natural disasters or war conditions, if the people are able to get help from another human being in the terms of having empathy and care, and really listening to them, and they can process what happened with someone else, that event won't be traumatic. So this is important to know also, that not all injurious events end up in trauma, but if we feel alone, even if there's someone there that's not attending to us, then that would result in trauma, or can result in trauma. So that's it for today. I hope that everybody's doing well. Now we're in the season of holidays, so I hope everybody enjoys it. But I want to announce that holidays are difficult for all of us in families, because we get back with families. And again, I said at the beginning, we're all injured in families. So it's very common that at holidays, when we're supposed to be very happy, families get together and things get triggered. So be prepared for triggers, and be prepared to have somebody that you can go talk to so you don't escalate. And the same for somebody else who gets triggered. Offer empathy and care so that they can become more regulated and calmer. Okay? So I hope this helps. Let other people know if you think that these videos are helpful, and subscribe so we have more people that can hear this. And again, happy holidays for everybody. Till the next time. Bye.